James, it's time to get up now.
Oh, I'm sorry, Moneypenny. You should have known better. I like to be shaken, not stirred. Here's the review.
Hey, what's up and welcome back to Interpreting the Stars. Today we're continuing on with our James Bond preparation marathon with the 21st James Bond film, and the first time the series was actually officially rebooted, not that it actually matters, is Daniel Craig's introduction as a secret agent with the license to kill. It's Casino Royale. Yeah, it's kind of weird that this movie is considered a reboot considering that Judi Dench plays M in both versions. I'm sure that won't confuse anybody. Right? Anyways, reboots can sometimes be a drag, but is this one felicitous? Let's get cracking. This review is brought to you by the word of the day, felicitous. Well chosen or suited to the circumstances. Casino Royale takes us back to the beginning after M has first granted James Bond with a 00 status. But when he immediately blows up an embassy, he's told to go on a vacation, which he does. But unbeknownst to M, he's still on the case, tracking down even more bad guys and finds one with Le Chiffre, a brilliant banker to terrorists who is trying to win over $100 million with a high-stakes poker game to pay back a debt. All Bond has to do is simply play the game with him and make him lose. Then he'll have no other choice but to beg for asylum and give MI6 all his juicy terrorist connections, right? So I think a reboot was actually necessary because it allows the viewer to take a deep breath after watching so many cartoony, corny versions of James Bond, and we're able to see a much more vulnerable version of him. He's been vulnerable in the past, of course, and even more serious with Timothy Dalton, but nobody really encapsulated most of the best aspects of James Bond until Daniel Craig came along. I'm sorry to all you Sean Connery loyalists, but he was a sexist James Bond that was quite often harassing women and was limited by the cheese of the 60s, which wasn't entirely his fault, but we're talking about spies here. Even if you loved the classic James Bond films, which I admire quite a bit on their own, you can't ignore that there was some issues here and there. Issues that I'm sure a lot of people thought were a part of the soul of James Bond and couldn't be fixed. But they were, and it still feels like Bond even though he's blonde with blue eyes. It still feels like Bond even though there isn't really any spy gear in the film. It still feels like Bond even though he isn't forcing himself on women, but respecting them. It still feels like Bond even though a mass majority of the film is just a card game. There's still high-octane action sequences, but it's just so well balanced that a long card game never really seems boring or tedious. In fact, thanks to the score and editing and select camera angles, the card game itself seems thrilling. Before any of the sequels to this movie came out, when I first saw it, it was my favorite James Bond film. And rewatching it now, my score has even gotten higher than it already was, which is already pretty dang high. Because when you look at the movie, even as its own thing, it's hard to find any flaws. The only flaw that I discovered was it was sometimes hard to remember who Le Chiffre was and why he's the bad guy and why it's so important. Because the opening of this film has a lot of action, so it's sometimes hard to keep the puzzle pieces together. You might understand Le Chiffre's overall idea, but James Bond was already working on a case before the film began, which just so happened to tie into Le Chiffre's. And I think that's what mostly confuses me, because it doesn't have the best introduction, nor does it have the best resolution. It's one of those movies that feels like it has a million different endings. You feel like this is the last scene, it's zooming out, you think the credits are about to roll, but they don't. Another scene, and another scene, and another scene. It just keeps on going like that, which feels a little bit lopsided for the pacing, but that's really only a minor complaint because that's only the resolution, the tail end of everything, and not the entire movie. Even when you look at the characters on their own, usually with the older films you have very cartoony characters, especially with the villains, but they were memorable because of that. Le Chiffre is a very subdued, quiet character played by Mads Mikkelsen, but even though he's not over the top like in the past, he's still massively memorable. From a visual standpoint, he has that face scar, which is a commonality with James Bond. Mads has always had a memorable voice. He bleeds from the eye, which is kind of cool, and analytically, he's a human computer. He can evaluate probabilities in the fraction of a second, which sounds exactly like a perfect James Bond villain, but instead of being a Looney Tunes character, the guy is believable. He's actually one of the most believable, realistic villains in James Bond history. It works extremely well, which is another reason why this film is so successful. great villain, incredible action, a decent theme song that I think gets better every time that I watch the movie. It's just a really fantastic movie. That brings me to my final score, which is where my technical unbiased score agrees with my bias in that this film is nearly flawless and exciting at the same time with a score of 96%. It'll be interesting to see how I score Skyfall on my rewatch, given how that has always been my favorite James Bond film. But first, I'll have to get through Quantum of Solace, which has always kind of been one of my least favorites, and I'm not looking forward to the rewatch at all. Anyways, when we average out the two scores together, we obviously come to the final rating of 96%, 96 out of 100 possible stars, or an A+ letter grade. It really is a really great film all on its own, and a perfect introduction to Daniel Craig's James Bond. I'm really looking forward to seeing him again in Spectre, which I've only seen one time, and I've never really reviewed that. But before I get there, I gotta rewatch some of the others. Anyways, if you've seen the movie, let me know your thoughts on it in the comment section down below. And as for YouTube, you guys know what to do. Hit that like, subscribe button, and bell to be notified when I come out with my next James Bond review. And until then, peace out.
Dave examines movies we just watch for fun. Davey is the expert. He is the #1 critic that I go to when I need a movie pick. Thanks for joining up with us. We think you're pretty.